Have you ever dealt with a stubborn HOA? You know, the kind that spends more time measuring your lawn than actually solving real problems. Well, let me tell you a story about my friend Mark, who took matters into his own hands in the most epic way possible. Mark lives in a beautiful neighborhood, but it has one major flaw: terrible drainage. Every time there was a heavy downpour, the streets would turn into rivers, and water would creep dangerously close to everyone's homes. Mark, being a proactive guy, brought this up at multiple HOA meetings. He presented studies, showed them weather forecasts, and practically begged them to invest in a proper drainage system. And what did the HOA board do? They laughed. They literally laughed in his face. The board president, a particularly smug guy named Mr. Henderson, told Mark he was being overly dramatic and that the association's funds were better spent on new petunia beds for the front entrance. Can you believe the nerve? So Mark decided if they wouldn't protect his home, he would. He wasn't just going to pile up a few sandbags and hope for the best. No, Mark is an engineer, and when he does something, he does it right. He spent weeks designing and planning. He consulted with structural experts, got all the necessary city permits bypassing the HOA entirely, which they hated, and started building a flood wall around his entire property. This wasn't some flimsy little fence. It was a serious, professional-grade, reinforced concrete wall, about 3 feet high, with a built-in drainage system that diverted water away from his foundation. It was a fortress. As you can imagine, the HOA went absolutely ballistic. They called it an eyesore. Mr. Henderson would walk his poodle past Mark's house every morning, shaking his head and muttering about property values. He even had the nerve to tell Mark his Great Wall of Paranoia was the laughingstock of the neighborhood. Other board members would drive by slowly, pointing and snickering. They sent him violation notices, threatening fines for an unapproved architectural modification. Mark just filed them away and kept on working Thomas can be. He knew what was coming. And then it came. The weather forecasters started talking about a storm system unlike anything the region had seen in decades. They called it a once-in-a-century event. The rain started on a Tuesday afternoon, a light drizzle at first, but by evening it was a torrential downpour. The sky opened up and the water just kept coming. Mark wasn't worried. He had his generator ready, plenty of supplies, and most importantly, his flood wall. He stood on his porch, watching the rain, feeling a sense of calm validation. Meanwhile, the neighborhood group chat was exploding. The first messages were just nervous comments about the rain. Then, the panic set in. Water is halfway up my driveway. The storm drains are completely overwhelmed. It's coming in under my garage door. The entire neighborhood was turning into a lake. The petunia beds the HOA was so proud of, they were submerged under 2 feet of muddy water. The real show, however, was happening right across the street. Mark watched as Mr. Henderson and 2 other board members, whose homes were now islands in a rising tide, were in a full-blown panic. The very men who had mocked Mark's wall were now frantically trying to build their own pathetic little dams out of garbage bags, garden soil, and soaked towels. It was a pitiful sight. Water was already pouring through Henderson's front door, carrying his welcome mat down the street. He was shouting at his wife, slipping on his own flooded lawn, and trying to bail out his living room with a small bucket. Mark just stood there, on his completely dry property, sipping a hot cup of coffee. His wall was holding perfectly. Not a single drop of water had breached his perimeter. The water level outside the wall was almost at the top, but inside, his lawn was just damp from the rain. It was like his home was a calm, dry island in the middle of a raging sea. As the storm raged on, the contrast became even more stark. Sirens wailed in the distance as emergency services were overwhelmed with calls from his neighbors. Mark could see the desperate glow of flashlights inside the flooded houses across the street. He saw furniture floating past windows. It was a disaster, a completely preventable disaster. All that ridicule, all those sneering comments from the HOA, they all washed away with the floodwaters. Mark didn't feel smug or arrogant. He just felt a quiet sense of relief and vindication. He had trusted his judgment, invested in his own security, and protected his family and his home when no one else would. The so-called leaders of the community were now facing thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of dollars in water damage, all because they preferred flowers over function. The next morning, the rain finally stopped. The scene was devastating. The entire neighborhood was a muddy, waterlogged wreck. Ruined couches, carpets, and appliances sat on curbs, but Mark's property was pristine. It was the only house on the block that was completely untouched. As the sun came out, Mr. Henderson waded through the knee-deep water on his lawn and looked over at Mark's dry, perfect home. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, his shoulders slumped in defeat, looking at the wall he had called a joke. That wall wasn't an eyesore anymore. It was a symbol of foresight, preparation, and the ultimate "I told you so." Mark never said a word to him. He didn't have to. He just gave a little nod, turned around, and went back inside his safe, dry house. The story of Mark's wall became a local legend, a powerful lesson in taking charge when bureaucracy fails. It goes to show that sometimes, you have to build your own solutions, even if the whole world is laughing at you. Because when the storm comes, the one who is prepared is the one who gets the last laugh. Thanks for watching. Let me know your own HOA stories in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more.